especially in how he relates to religion, struck me as a very like Trumpian character, because he's, the way Donald Trump like relates to Christianity is very like, oh yes, of course I, blah blah blah. But then like people ask him if he has a favorite Bible verse, and he just makes something up, or like he clearly has no actual knowledge of most of Christianity, but he doesn't reject it either. He like vocally is very embracing of it. I would argue because he sees that as something that furthers his ambitions.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Paul Thomas Anderson's There Will Be Blood. Before we begin, if you enjoy our show and want to help us keep it going, you can support us in two ways. The first is to listen to Cinema of Meaning on Nebula, which lets you enjoy each episode completely ad-free and a week early. The second way is to join our Discord community on Patreon, where you can discuss movies with us and with fellow listeners. Both Nebula and Patreon will also give you instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes, which by now has grown into a significant catalog. For more information, check out the description where you can find everything else that you need. Thank you for listening to Cinema of Meaning. Now on to the show. Thomas, this is actually the first time that we're discussing a Paul Thomas Anderson movie, right?
Correct, yes.
I feel like we've been trying to do one for like a year, and they always ended up being like a perpetual second choice. Always just falling.
No shade to Paul, by the way. I think like a lot of his movies just feel very monumental, and they're kind of a task to take on. And so we kept looking at like, we should talk about The Master, we should talk about maybe Phantom Thread or There Will Be Blood. And every time I think about it, I'm like, man, those are going to be interesting movies to try to discuss, to just grapple with. So, but we finally stopped putting it off. Now we're taking one of the biggest ones kind of by the horns here. So I'm very excited about this discussion.
I think also it might be his most mainstream one in some ways.
Definitely the one I think has garnered the most sort of universal critical acclaim, or the most recognition. It might be the only one that's won Oscars. Is that correct? I don't know about that, but it won 2 Oscars, so it's got that going for it. But I don't know if this is my favorite. I think Phantom Thread for me is vying for the top spot alongside this one, but this one is definitely up there and is like a classic of. It's one of those movies that to me feels like already a 21st century classic. I'm excited to dive into it. But
which kind of funny because watching it now, I hadn't seen it since it came out. I think you love Paul Thomas Anderson's movies a bit more than I do.
I did a big breakdown of kind of the evolution of his filmmaking. I think that was like last year or something. You can find it on my channel, but when I did that, he's one of those directors who early on in sort of my interest in film, I set out to like watch everything he had made. And so he was one of the first directors who I kind of checked off I watched his entire filmography sort of very intentionally. Then when I made that video, I rewatched it all again. So he's one of those directors I think he's one of a very bold and very interesting contemporary director who has a super strong and unique voice. I think definitely. I have mixed feelings about a lot of his movies, and I don't exactly know how to like a lot of them I don't feel like I completely understand, but I find them very interesting and compelling anyway. There's a lot there, sort of on an intuitive level, like the way he writes is very interesting to me. You know, a lot of it is about weird characters just doing stuff that you kind of have to read into to try to understand, rather
feels
than
very literary in the way
Yes,
he makes
yeah.
movies. Yeah.
So I guess that would be like my summary of like kind of how I feel about Paul Thomas Anderson. I think he's one of the most interesting, but also, you know, there's movies like the first time I watched Magnolia, I was like, this is an incredible masterpiece. And then that's
Same.
a movie that has kind of almost like come down. I mean, it's still, I think, incredible what he was doing, especially at that age. But it's a movie that as I've rewatched it, I think I have appreciated less, which is odd. But then the reverse has been true with some of his other films, where I think the movie of his that I've watched the most is Phantom Thread. And every time I have watched that one, I felt like I got more out of it. This one is also kind of like that. This was my third viewing. Yeah, there's a lot of weird, new sort of very almost like, this is not a subtle movie, but a lot of what is interesting about this movie is in the subtle bits. Anyway, I'm monologuing here. I should let you maybe lay some groundwork.
Yeah, no, I share your fascination and interest in Paul Thomas Anderson's work, but I feel like I just haven't given him that kind of attention to really love it, and that's maybe like, that's on me, that's not on a critique on his films. Because now that I think of it, I've seen most of his films, I think, only once, with maybe Magnolia being the exception, which I had the same as you, where that's one that I instantly fell in love with. But I haven't revisited that one in a couple of years, so I'm not sure how I would feel about it if I were to watch it again today. But yeah, so There Will Be Blood, Phantom Thread, The Master, all of those movies, they caught my interest, and I told myself, oh, I have to watch these again in order to fully appreciate them, and for some reason I just never really gotten around to it. Until today. So for me, like I said, as I said, I rewatched it. I think it was this. I'm pretty sure it was the second time I've seen it since seeing it the first time around the time it came out. I think, or maybe a little bit later. But yeah, the thing that struck me the most, just from the opening. By the way, I completely forgot how it opened with this very long stretch of just silence, which I thought was really interesting.
There's like a short film, like a 15-minute prologue that has no dialogue whatsoever.
But for me, the thing that struck me was just the look of it and the way it felt like a movie that was shot in maybe the 60s or something. And I mean that in a good way. You know, it feels very timeless in a way, and you know, timeless in the sense that it could have been made in the 60s, it could have been made in the 80s, 90s, or in the 2000s as it was. But it has that very classical look where the image is kind of tainted, or like it's not clean, it's not perfect, it's like damaged and just imperfect in interesting ways. And it also has that kind of film look where the bright areas tend to be a little bit overlit and the dark shadows tend to be really dark, which really, especially today, stands in such a stark contrast with the more digital look, where even if they make or try to make it look less digital, you can still see that there's a high dynamic range there in the raw data. And I feel like this movie feels so analog compared to that, and also less color graded. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of touch up that was done, but it has that. That's something that I really miss about, or really miss in new movies, that I really enjoy in like movies from the 60s era, is that it just feels like they just put a camera somewhere and filmed it and didn't color grade everything into like some surreal-ish
Right.
vibe
Yeah.
in post-production. You know, a lot of movies, especially if you see modern movies that are shot on real locations that you can still feel it's a little bit off. It still feels a little bit, um, it just feels a little bit over-processed or over-stylized, even
Yeah.
in the basic way the images are color graded nowadays. But anyways, that's a bit of a tangent
Right. I will
on
say,
presentation. Yeah.
just on that point, like I feel like in the filmmaking discussion, it was a big thing like 7 years ago, to this debate over film versus digital,
Oh
and
yeah.
everybody was talking about it. And in my mind, I feel, thankfully, I think we've moved on from that conversation. It's just like digital is great and better for
Mm-hmm.
some circumstances. Some people have the privilege and the money to shoot on film, and it can still make really beautiful results. It's just different tools, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of people who are still shooting on film and maximizing the potential of the way film looks, Paul Thomas Anderson, I think, is kind of,
Yeah.
absolutely kind of one of the best people still using film
Yeah.
in a way that's super that maximizes the strengths of film itself.
He really relishes in the character that it creates, whereas
Yes.
like Nolan, for example, he's also a very fervent lover of film, but he seems to use it more to just maximize resolution and image quality, whereas I think Paul Thomas Anderson is more about creating a certain atmosphere or using film to create a certain atmosphere.
Yeah.
That being said, I do think that it's perfectly possible to create that look with digital film. I think it was Ryan Johnson who played around with that for Knives Out, for example, where he really pursued a more filmic look, which I think he um, pretty successfully achieved. So I'm sure, like by now, in the whole film versus digital debate, I feel like we we can kind of move on from it, because whatever film can do, digital can do now mostly, especially when it comes to creating the look of it. I'm sure there's like super experts on this that will fight me
Right.
on that, but
Yeah.
for to a general audience who isn't really down into the nitty gritty of the technical side, I think it's um, you can kind of make digital look any way that you want, including
Yeah.
like film. Um, but yeah, that being said, it's fun to see someone still embrace that look of it with all the um, imperfections and the quirks that it comes with. And yeah, that's something that I just really enjoyed going into it, and that especially combined with that silent prologue where we just get to see this story unfold without dialogue or without too much like I don't know, like too much energy maybe. Like even there's a certain quietness and stillness to the way the movie opens, especially for the if you know what is to come, because
Right.
it does unfold into this grand epic about greed and capitalism versus God and man versus family and whatnot. And um, especially the second time you're watching it, or the third or the fourth or whatever, it's so interesting to know what is to come and then still have that opening that's so
Yeah.
quiet and yeah, that's just um, very fascinating.
You learn a surprising amount about the character, I think, too, in that opening.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking this time about the way he's digging this hole, he's down in this pit. It's kind of this monumental task that he's undertaking alone, which kind of sets
Mm-hmm.
this groundwork for maybe some of how the character develops, the way Daniel Plainview feels later in his life. You can ground it in this moment where you can see how maybe he feels like, I did this work, I found this stuff, and then I built everything I have now with my raw bare hands, like down, literally digging it out of the dirt. I think that doesn't really obviously I don't think that justifies his later attitude, but I think it's a depicting sort of the sheer difficulty of what he was undertaking on his own at the beginning, kind of maybe helps us understand some of the mentality that the character has later on. But also there's little details in there. He drops some dynamite, he exposes this oil, and he gets these little chunks of rock, and there's an accident and he breaks his leg. And there's this moment during this sequence where he like gets up off the ground. He's like, oh, I'm alive. He kind of groans and then immediately reaches for a rock that's laying beside him and kind of like checks it to see what's there. And meanwhile, his leg is like, snapped in half. And then it cuts directly from that to like this place where they're kind of evaluating how much gold and silver content is in the rock. And he's laying there on the ground with his leg in a splint while they're like giving him the results. And it immediately sets up this character who his own physical well-being is second to his goal of finding and achieving gold and success, and this kind of ambition he has to succeed. So I love the way that all the groundwork for that is all laid out completely without any exposition. We just see this character who has this determination and this absolute ambition at the cost of essentially everything else. So yeah, I think that sequence it really lays the groundwork for the rest of the film in a really strong way.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it also gives him this sort of heroic claim to whatever he's about to embark on. Like you feel in that moment as an audience member, I know at least for me, like you feel like whatever he's about to achieve, like he's earned it because he did this all on his own. He was down there, got injured, got himself up. Looks like he dragged himself like all the way across the mountains. Yeah. Because that's actually, you have the opening shot with this sort of the shining like musical stinger, and then it cuts to Daniel in the pit. But then later when he climbs out with the broken leg and the camera, I think it sort of pans up and there's the same shot of the mountains. I'm not sure if there was a sort of because the first shot already establishes a sort of foreboding, and then I think that kind of pays off when you realize, oh, that's the mountains he's gonna have to drag himself over to safety or to ensure he's not gonna die in the desert over there. But yeah, I think that's something that, especially also because of the length of the sequence, that's something that does stick in your mind as you see everything else unfold. That beneath all the business talk that comes later and all the empire building, there's still a man there or so in there who is who had both of his legs on the ground, so to say, who was willing and is still willing to put his hands in the dirt and to do the work himself. And I don't think that necessarily makes it a heroic story. I don't think that's what the movie is doing, but at the same time, if you kind of assume this movie as a not so subtle metaphor for the rise of capitalism,
right,
and the way it completely steamrolled over maybe religion and other older forms of giving life meaning, I do get the sensation that there is a subtle hint of like sympathy maybe on Paul Thomas Anderson's side about the sort of the origins of capitalism, that he does acknowledge or recognize that it did begin with these men like Daniel who wanted more and were willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And even though he later explores how this whole path kind of led him astray and eventually led to his own sort of unhappiness and I'm not sure, I was going to say ruin, but I'm not sure he's actually ruined at the end of the movie, not materially at least, maybe
we could say his spiritual ruin. Yeah.
Did you know there's a whole Cinema of Meaning bonus catalog with exclusive episodes on movies like Fight Club, Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, Drive, and many, many more? It's just one of the many perks you get on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula. On Nebula, you can follow all your favorite creators and watch their work completely ad and sponsor-free. From podcasts to video essays and even a wide variety of educational classes, including one from yours truly that dives deep into story analysis and into the way stories function as vehicles for meaning. There's no shortage of amazing stuff here, a lot of which you cannot find anywhere else. It's a platform that really invests in its creators. Cinema of Meaning certainly wouldn't exist without it, which is why joining Nebula is also a great way to support our work. Be sure to use our personal link, that's nebula.tv/cinemaofmeaning, to get a special discount. Again, that's nebula.tv/cinemaofmeaning to get started with Nebula today. Thank you to Nebula for sponsoring Cinema of Meaning. Now, back to the show.
I think you're totally right, though. It's, well, kind of like I was saying, I think PTA and how he's depicting this is, this is a pretty unsympathetic character, so there's not really any moment where I feel that much sympathy for Daniel Plainview, but I think he does depict Daniel Plainview, especially with this performance. I think he allows us to some extent understand the character, which to me is really important, where I feel like I can see why he is the way he is, or why he becomes the way he is. And some of that is this like feeling of entitlement that does come from, not necessarily out of thin air, but from this sort of this starting point of, yeah, I dug a hole in the ground and oil came out of it. I did that work. But it just kind of expands from there. The other thing that is set up in this opening that ends up being a key element of the film and theme is we see him getting his son, HW is the son of one of the workers that he has at this first well. We don't really know anything about the situation. We just see a guy with a baby that's just kind of hanging around camp. They anoint him with oil from the ground. And then the father gets killed in an accident, and Daniel Plainview just, I guess, assumes that now HW is his responsibility. We see him kind of caring for the baby, and then on a train with HW, pouring some alcohol in his bottle and feeding it to him. Yeah. And then that's our transition point to cut into our first kind of jump into the future, where we then see HW as a older boy and Daniel Plainview a bit more successful, and he's kind of giving a speech and pitching why these townspeople should accept him as kind of the oil man to come and drill their land for oil. And this first speech that he gives, I think, is also kind of a key element in kind of setting the stage for this character initially, because there's a lot of these moments, but this is the first big one where I start to get a sense pretty early on that like half of what is coming out of his mouth is just pure lies, because he's immediately talking about, in this first speech, I think it is, he immediately starts talking about how he doesn't make mistakes. He bad things don't happen when he drills. Like he presents himself as this consummate professional oil man who, nothing goes wrong and it's like, we just watched 15 minutes of him like falling down holes and dropping stuff on people's heads and killing them. And it's just like we immediately see this contrast between the reality of what happens when he's working, and also how he's trying to present himself to other people. And I think that's another like interesting thing that's set up here initially, but then we see that kind of play out repeatedly throughout the film.
Mm-hmm. And he also presents himself as a family man there, which
Yes,
is also
right.
makes you question, like, did he just assume HW as truly out of like the sympathy of his heart, and because he longs for fatherhood, or at least thinks that this child is deserving of a father, or did he, as he jumping ahead to the end a little bit, but as he proclaims at the end, like, did he just need a cute little boy's face to help him sell himself as a family man to these villagers or local citizens or whatever?
I want to ask you about this. Maybe this is jumping too far ahead, but
yeah.
What do you think is the case there? Because the more I watch this character, the more I feel like what he says at the end there, where he's like, I never loved you. I was just using you. To me, it seems like is clearly a lie. Like, I think he did actually, to some extent, obviously he's flawed, he's abusive, he does these horrible things throughout the film. But I think to some extent he did actually feel this love for HW, and that's part of the kind of tragedy of this character, is his inability to actually engage with that. I don't know. I was curious what you felt about that part of his character.
Yeah, I also feel like at the end there, he's that's when his son is grown up and he wants to become his own businessman, and Daniel seems hurt by that because now he has to see him as a competitor instead of as a partner, and so it does feel like he just lashes out in spite there. But yeah, I've thought about that, and you have this concept in this very basic concept in script writing, where when you have like a main character, you establish like a want, or at least something that the character thinks that they want.
Yeah.
And you have a need, which is the thing that they actually need, but that they don't know, because at first, like, they're driven by what they desire, and then at the end, they instead find what they need. And this movie does not play by those conventions, at least not explicitly. But I do feel like if you can read between the lines a little bit, or sort of look at the subtext, there is, it's a little bit of speculation there, but I feel like there is something to be said about Daniel believing that he needs, his want is believing that he needs all this money, that he essentially needs to build this empire so that he can get away from people, and he sees the worst in people, and everyone seems to prove him right, but at every hint of a flaw in another person, he's also the first to cut them out or to push them out. So whenever he talks about seeing the worst in people, he's also the first one to sort of affirm that. Whenever he sees like a tiny flaw, he blows it up and then writes that person off completely. So I feel like maybe in that sense, his real need is actually more like a desire for true connection, or a desire for family at least, or which he finds in HW initially, but he also is, he has these internal struggle where he might want to be like truly a father or have a son, but at the same time he also has that ambition, he has that competition, he has that drive to make things work out in the way that he sees it. He wants to shape the world in his image. And so I feel like the father-son relation between him and HW is going well until the accident where HW loses his hearing, which kind of breaks, from there on, breaks the image that Daniel had of what their relation was going to look like and what he as a son was going to look like.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's like his tragedy. He can't help but see the world for what it is or accept the world for what it is. He has to make it his own or just push himself away from it. And yeah, I think that's to me at least is what I think defines his tragedy the most, that he just ends up pushing away everything or everyone who could have given him a meaningful, or who he could have had a meaningful relation with, just because he just cannot there's this other part in him that just cannot accept that he doesn't have control over these other people or just
Right.
over the world in general. And I feel like that's also what leads to him wanting to seclude himself or isolate himself from everyone else. I think he says that explicitly, right? That he just wants to earn enough money so that he can move away from people. And I think that there's a sort of second thread in that development where after he sends his son away, he meets this supposed lost brother of his, who he bonds with sort of seemingly genuinely for a little bit, until there's like cracks that start to form in his story, and he finds out that, or he begins to suspect that he's not actually his brother, and then he confronts him, and it turns out that he was in fact an imposter. And so even though this imposter, he tries to plead like, I'm still your friend, and I did meet your real brother, that's how I got the story, but to Daniel, that's like, one tiny crack, and you're done for. Like the relation is broken, and there's no way it can be healed. Not saying that he should have, like the other guy did pull off a pretty dirty trick.
Right. Yeah.
But still, it does say a lot about Daniel's character, I think, in the way that he handles it. He shoots him in the face, so that's pretty drastic.
Yeah, he responds pretty drastically. I think like those rejections kind of reveal this maybe need or desire that he doesn't even understand for this kind of human connection and family. He kind of desperately wants people around him that he thinks the way he sees it is like, I just want some people I can trust. And he doesn't really see that kind of, that is kind of a problem of his own creation to a certain degree. And like, people are flawed. And so you can't just write somebody off entirely because they did one little thing and then now you can't ever trust them again. So he sees family, he's kind of like, oh, family are the people I can trust, and everybody else is a competitor and they're out to get me, they're out to slit my throat. And that, there's stuff in there about that being the way he treats other people. There's also, I think, something in there, not just about the way he's responding to people, but the way success kind of can create, capitalistic success can kind of create this incentive where, or this situation where it can feel difficult to trust people because, why does Henry show up and pretend to be his brother? Because he is wealthy and has a lot of money. Henry's not just trying to be his friend for fun. Although it does seem like they genuinely connect, it's like he also has some kind of legitimate, there's at least some basis there for distrusting most people, because most people are trying to use him or use his money and success to get somewhere. And
capitalism sort of renders everything transactional, and so any motivation that does not seem, where the transaction is not clear, then becomes suspect.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the real turning point at the end with HW, is HW is like, I'm going to go start my own company. I'm going to do my own drilling. And Daniel is basically like, that destroys my image of you. That makes you my competitor. and now you've become something else, and that's when he denounces him as being family. And so I don't know, there's some interesting thing there where in his mind family and competition can't coexist. And he also has no real family. So he's kind of lost in this space of like the thing he desperately needs on a deepest level, he can't access, partially because of who he is as a person, but also partially just because of the kind of the environment that he exists in and the details of his life. We don't know much about like why he left home. We get a few details from the Henry, the brother impersonator, but it's, obviously he chose to leave for some reason instead of staying with the family that he had.
Yeah, I was going to say we don't learn a lot about Daniel's backstory. I think he had a sister. But other than that, there's this other moment where he does seem sort of protective of the little girl that ultimately ends up marrying HW, where she was, I think, had an abusive father that he does seem to take sort of personally without him standing to gain anything from it capitalistically, so to say.
Right.
So that did have me thinking, oh, maybe there's something there about maybe he did feel he had an abusive father, or maybe he did have an abusive father, or came from some form of family where at least, something had to be not right in the environment that he came from that gave him not just the distrust, but maybe also the drive to really build something for himself where he did not have to rely on anything, not necessarily family, but also not community or, not even God, because I think that's the next interesting conflict here is that the conflict that he has with Eli, who played by Paul Dano.
Paul Dano, yeah.
Who is this local town minister. I'm not sure what the correct title is there.
Preacher,
yeah. That also ends up being this very contentious relation over the course of the movie that ultimately ends in Daniel murdering Eli in his bowling alley in this great big mansion at the end. Eli has a twin brother named Paul, which I got confused with for a second.
Right. The titular blood seems to be eventually Eli's blood at the end, I guess.
What did you think of that whole relation?
So this is the other big, we kind of broke down the family aspect of the narrative. And then I think the other big central conflict you mentioned at the beginning is this one, sort of the conflict between these two characters, which is also, we can kind of look at as like a metaphor about capitalism versus religion, or the way in which sort of, I think this is a very like postmodern film in the sense that it's about this narrative of, capitalism arose and is kind of just trampling over everything, the tradition of history, of religion. It kind of it's consuming religion here, and eventually kind of this character ends up being capitalistic in his own, or like eventually Eli's ambitions are revealed to be financial as well, essentially. I think kind of towards the end. But yeah, this rivalry / weird partnership kind of starts with Daniel showing up on this ranch that ends up being kind of the center of a lot of the story.
Yeah, he was tipped off by Paul, the brother of, which I think becomes a little bit important at the end, so I do want to mention it here.
Paul shows up, tips him off to this ranch, says, hey, there's oil there. if you pay me, I'll tell you where it is. He pays him, or Daniel pays him, shows up at this ranch, doesn't talk about the oil, tries to buy it. He kind of surveys the land, finds the oil, and tries to buy it for, as he says, quail prices, not oil prices. But Eli, the brother of Paul, is there with the family, and he understands that the oil is valuable on some level. And so the deal he makes is, oh, if you're successful, make a donation of $5,000 to my church, which Daniel kind of agrees to, but we learn he never fulfills. But as this oil mining town is built up around this new well that Daniel ends up digging in this area, Eli kind of sees this as an opportunity to build his congregation. And so he builds a new church. He strikes a deal with Daniel that the new road they put in will lead to the church. And we kind of see these two things develop together. But Daniel, for whatever reason, sees this character as a kind of competition. There's a weird relationship there. One of the early signs of it is the church has been built, and Eli comes to Daniel and he's like, hey, when you are starting up the well, I can give it a blessing, and you get me to come up and I'll bless the well, and this is great for both of us. And I think Daniel kind of sees that as like Eli trying to use him kind of for his own success. And so Daniel very blatantly kind of snubs Eli, and kind of gives the blessing himself. So there's this ongoing, that competition never really ends. It kind of continues between them. So I don't know how exactly to summarize this arc, except that I think the general idea here that the movie seems to be getting at is how these two things, how religion and capitalistic ambition can become kind of intertwined in a way, where Daniel is only willing to engage with religion when it meets to further his goals, and Eli sees all this like capitalistic success as a route to achieve his goal of building this huge church and kind of becoming his spiritual ambition, I guess we could say.
Yeah, I agree, but at the same time, I'm not sure if I really experienced their relation as a true competition where there's like two equal forces striving for dominance. To me, it feels more like Eli being this tiny character that maybe at the beginning is sort of equal to Daniel, but then so quickly Daniel grows into this giant that just stomps him into the ground, and then once Eli comes begging at the end, he just finishes him off. And I feel like it's almost like from the beginning, just a very slow murder that just gets completed by the end of it.
Yeah.
He even literally says, Daniel says, I'm finished at the end, or I finished.
Right.
But yeah, I think the thing that Daniel sees when he sees Eli is just, I think he just sees a swindler, someone who's also selling fairy tales and
right.
false miracles and promises of beautiful things that won't ever come to fruition. And I'm not sure to what extent that's he recognizes some of himself in that, or that he just despises maybe I'm not sure if hypocrisy is the right word of it, but he just he sees Eli and he feels that he's sort of two-faced, that he promises all these beautiful things, whereas deep down he knows he's not really giving that to these people. And that's maybe him projecting his own attitude onto Eli, who might be truly convinced that he's doing what he's doing.
Right.
Whereas Daniel might be, he gives all these beautiful speeches, but he knows he's in it for his own gain. He's in it for his own money.
I think I just want to throw something out there real quick on this point, because I didn't really notice this until this watch of the film, but there seems to be something that I think Eli has that I do think Daniel wants and doesn't have, which is Daniel gives all these, we see Daniel several times giving these speeches, to the different townspeople. When he gives the blessing, he kind of has these moments where he's up in front of the people and he's giving this speech of like, I'm bringing you all these good things. I'm bringing, success and bread to your town, et cetera, et cetera. And the way people respond to that is never with warmth, with love. In the first scene, they just start arguing loudly and he walks out. There's times where there's kind of like blank looks on their faces. At the end of his blessing, it just kind of ends, and then the people slowly meander away and he walks up to the well. There's this, he is not able to sort of connect charismatically with the sort of the congregation, quote unquote, that he's speaking to. But that's in direct contrast to, the first time he goes to the church and he sees Eli giving this big emotional performance and people are cheering and responding to it. And then there's another scene where nothing else is really going on, but we just see Daniel kind of sitting there and he's just watching Eli, and the people from the town are sort of like hugging him and talking to him and caring for him. They obviously have this kind of love for Eli as the pastor. And I think Daniel kind of sees that as something that he does not have, that Eli is able to get for some reason. So it's subtle, but I think there's like there is something that I don't know if Daniel ultimately needs that, because he can just bulldoze through everything with money and whatever, but there is sort of like a charisma to how people respond to Eli that Daniel doesn't have. So I don't know if that's part of maybe his envy or despite why he despises Eli.
Yeah, it's an interesting bit of his psychology, because on the one hand it does feel like Daniel genuinely does not want to be in community. Like, he doesn't want to have to deal with all these people. I think he as he said in the beginning, like, he just wants the money and get out, which is what he kind of does at the end. But at the same time, he also feels like Eli should not deserve it, because he feels like he's a phony. And I'm not sure. It might just be a sort of general discontent with the world and the way it functions, and that even though he doesn't want anything to do with it, he still hates it and still kind of wants to throw a wrench in it and expose it for what it is, if he had the chance, and which he gets at the end when Eli comes begging for money, which is a very unwise thing to do to a true capitalist, because I feel like, the whole point of like that sort of capitalism is it's all about either having power or like posturing power. If you show weakness, the moment you come begging for mercy, then you're gonna be trampled on, because that's when you show your weakness, and that's when, under capitalist law, you're almost, it's right for others to sort of exploit you. You're destined to become like this victim.
Yeah.
And that's also when he reveals that Eli comes with his sort of power play is that there's this little bit of land that that Daniel failed to buy at the beginning, and so he's now coming to offer it. And then Daniel reveals like, he says like, I have everything around it. I've been drilling, like I've been draining it from all sides underneath. There's nothing there anymore, and I don't need that land. And so he kind of takes away that final trump card that Eli has, and that's literally when it's over for him. But I do think that Paul comes back there in an interesting way, because that's when Daniel mentions that Paul took that early sort of payoff money, or that information money, and he started his own business that is like modestly prosperous. He's making $5,000 a week with 3 different oil wells, I think it was. I'm not sure how much that is relatively to today, but it seems like he's become wealthy, but not maybe like extravagantly wealthy as Daniel is. But I'm kind of wondering if there's a hint there, if there exists a sort of synergy between, on the one hand, Eli's character, and on the other hand, the more capitalist qualities that Daniel has, that Paul Thomas Anderson sort of wanted to maybe wink at. He doesn't really expand on that beyond these 2 lines in which he mentions Paul, but it is interesting that there's a twin brother who now kind of exists in the middle of them, who sort of has these qualities, who's incorporated qualities of both of those characters. He has the literal genetics of Eli, while also having the business savviness of Daniel. But yeah, there's everything else on that subject would probably be speculation, because we don't learn a lot more about it.
Yeah. It's a tough one to tease out, and this is where Paul Thomas Anderson's sort of style of storytelling becomes, I think, kind of difficult to discuss, because you get the same thing in like The Master. What exactly he's getting at here is really kind of more poetic and intuitive than it is like a clear statement about the themes that he's laying out. It's the what I see in this movie is not like Paul PTA saying, oh, capitalism has destroyed the church, or the church just uses capitalism for its own thing, or this or that. It's that's all kind of maybe in there, but it's also just about the weird relationship between those things and what that feels like, and also just these characters. And he's drawing parallels, and there's this rhyming to it, but it's not the style of story that comes to this nice concise conclusion where we can walk away going, yes, a picture of how capitalism beat religion forever and now it's game over. There's something more, almost weirder and more complicated than that, I think, in what it's depicting. It did strike me though too, just like, I think what it depicts in a certain way is something very accurate. Not to throw out too many buzzwords that will make the podcast controversial, but this character this time around, especially in how he relates to religion, struck me as a very like Trumpian character, because he's the way Donald Trump like relates to Christianity is very like, oh yes, of course I blah blah blah, but then like people ask him if he has a favorite Bible verse and he just makes something up, or like he clearly has no actual knowledge of like most of Christianity, but he doesn't reject it either. He like vocally is very embracing of it. I would argue because he sees that as something that furthers his ambitions, and that's exactly what like Daniel does in this movie, which is like, he's just kind of like, oh, I don't reject the church. I'm not like rejecting this outright necessarily. I'm just going to like kind of it's yeah, oh sure, you know, I'm going to use this to the extent to which it is it helps me achieve my ambitions, or how he thinks it is going to, you know, and that's played out most blatantly in that big scene where he goes to the church and goes through this whole like repentant ritual, just so that he can build his pipeline to the, you know, to the ocean or whatever. So I think there's like that the way Daniel's relationship to religion is depicted is like emblematic of something that I think like is a way that we see it reflected in reality, at least with certain people or certain characters at certain times.
Yeah, I do feel like even though it's the subtext of capitalism and the all-consuming growth of it is so on the nose almost, that's not to say that it's not, or that's not to say it's simplistic. It's not without these deeper layers and deeper implications that still make, to me it still makes it worth to talk about it and not skip over it as, oh yeah, obviously it's about capitalism, because I do think it's still quite nuanced in the way it depicts just how capitalism has grown and what the real implications are, and the way it affected, like as you said, the church, but also the family, in the way that it's, at least when it comes to the church, it's to some extent made the church, at least in this case, it seemed like it made the church sort of submissive and almost subservient to the workings of capitalism, because at the end of the day, a church also needs money to survive, and now in a more capitalist society, that means it, where maybe the church can no longer rely on like the state, because, you know, there's now also separation of church and state in many Western countries. So that now also means that the church has to commercialize itself to some extent, and even if you look at like a level beyond just the church as an institution, you know, there's the individual preachers that now also have to wrestle with the devil of capitalism, as Eli has also failed to do at the end, or he claims he's been consumed by the devil and been sinful, and I think that's also something that's clearly happening, at least in America. You know, you have these really ridiculously wealthy preachers who I'm not even sure like what exact movement or like part of Christianity that is. I think it's like a specific subset of Christianity that
it's not all like, it's not centralized under one necessarily one sort of institution, but there's various like denominational and non-denominational evangelical churches where, you know, one particular pastor or one particular group has become, you know, incredibly successful, usually via some kind of like tele-evangelism.
Yeah.
You know, you have like Joel Osteen type characters, but then also Kenneth Copeland is another one where he's flying around everywhere on private jets and talking about how the reason he has to fly on a private jet and not on a regular jet is because, you know, a regular airplane is a tube full of demons. It's his words exactly. Yeah. So yeah, they're not all necessarily associated, but you know, if you look at like, they exist, and their success is this sort of like kind of weird, you know, version of you know, they've built their singular church into like a brand and then a company, and then this kind of, they fill out stadiums with people, and there's this very like capitalistic ambition to the way they, you know, they run their churches essentially.
Yeah, and I feel like that's at least in part made possible by capitalism, as Daniel does in the movie,
right?
Sort of first co-opting the language of religion to sell the people on his brand of success or wealth or transcendence or whatever he was preaching to them. And so that's, I think, the interesting capitalism on church effect that the movie demonstrates. But at the same time, there's the part on the family where it kind of, I feel like that part dives more deeply into the what I talked about earlier, with where relations are turned into transactional, or at least primarily transactional, where which sort of erodes the potential for personal connections when there's when the value you can offer to someone else or assume or take from someone else becomes the primary drive for interaction, and not just no reasons unrelated to that. Not because you like someone else or want to spend time with them, or because we long for companionship or whatever. And I feel like that's for me at least what's most interesting about the whole family sub-story here, is that that's what to me most clearly shows the way capitalism has eroded to some extent the way we deal with each other and the way we interact with each other.
Yeah.
There's also, maybe you can sort of include the way workers are treated into this, where they also just become accidents instead of human lives that are at stake and are lost sometimes. There's that one accident where early on someone is killed, I think quite shortly after they set up that first well in the town.
Yeah.
Someone gets hit in the head and they sort of drag him out, and it doesn't feel like, it just feels like they're taking out some broken equipment instead of really being worried about the actual person that was involved there.
And Daniel kind of dumps the responsibility for taking care of that guy off on Eli. Like, he's like, oh, can you make sure his stuff gets to his family? Maybe you can, like, give him last rites or something like that. There's this kind of like abdication of responsibility for that death, and just kind of passing that off onto Eli.
Yeah. So yeah, that to me, I think is the most in summary, in conclusion, the capitalism metaphor and how it isn't just like a movie about capitalism, but also one that really shows in quite like in not unsignificant detail how and why and where exactly capitalism has had its effects on our society and on ourselves. And I don't think it's the movie's main thing, but it is, I think, what for me elevates this movie to from being more than just one person's story to really being more of this a classical archetype of something that really reveals something meaningful about the way our world as we know it today came into being from a variety of different perspectives.
Yeah. One more thing I want to say that kind of connects those two themes that I saw this time around was how there's this moment, HW, he loses his hearing in this accident. That scene is incredible. This oil derrick explodes into flames, and Daniel Plainview is at first concerned about HW, and he kind of rescues him and then dumps him where he's safe for the time being. But then there's this moment where he's like, everything's burning. His son was just like, injured in this thing, and he's like giddy because he's struck, this huge ocean of oil. Is just such a reflection of, the earlier moment where he's like worried about whether or not he found gold when he just broke his leg. But that's not the point I wanted to make. So he loses his hearing, all that happens, and then some of his competitors, I forget the name of the company, but one of his competitors, a group of them come to him and they're like, hey, let's buy you out. You can spend time with your son. we'll give you all this money. You can just focus on what's important to you, which is family. And that, to me, I think, I don't want to speculate too much. We don't know what's going on in the mind of the character. He might have abandoned HW anyway, but I think that moment is a big part of what drives him to separate himself from HW, because he sees sort of his love for HW and desire to care for HW as a weakness that is being exploited by his competitors to try to get him to set aside this success and ambition that he wants. And so he has to make a clean break, because in his mind it's like, I can't have this thing around that might lead to me making decisions that would make me less successful. And then, I don't know. There's just an interesting relationship between that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he makes that big show later where he's like, look, I can be with my boy, to them, and throws a temper tantrum in the
that's a good one.
Saloon or
I
whatever.
thought of that. There's also one other affirmation of that, I think, that comes back at the very end, where we have the time jump, and then there's this like 2 clips of like a flashback to where I think it's after HW tells his father that he's leaving him to go to Mexico, and then I think that's when there's a little bit of an insert with these 2 scenes where Daniel's just playing with his young son, but then also he's immediately shown being called off for work while HW clearly wants more time with him, which also again affirms that sort of, I maybe want this, but at the same time, like, my other drive or my other desire is pushing me that way. And that's I think what's ultimately also so tragic about him.
I wanted to say one thing about kind of the relationship between Daniel and the church. Is there is this interesting dynamic in that, where in that scene where he goes to the church and he repents, there's, the movie's kind of critiquing the church in a lot of ways, I think, and showing kind of its corruption. But there's also this moment where there's something in that scene, like he goes in and it feels like he kind of has this attitude of like, okay, I'm just going to get this over with. I'm going to, repent of my sins, blah, 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 and then I'll get what I want, which is the pipeline. But he gets up there and he kneels down, and Daniel starts hitting him with you've abandoned your child. And you can kind of see, especially in the way it's performed, I think, there's this like, you can tell that is the knife that's just like, that one stabs straight into him. And it really, there's this weird sense in which it does seem like he almost gets some kind of, like that does genuinely impact him in some way. There is almost some kind of catharsis that he gets from that kind of repentance of this thing that I think he genuinely like feels bad about. And that's another moment that kind of makes me feel like ultimately maybe he does like love HW and feel bad about that situation. He just ultimately chooses to reject that. And that's why he's, just like blackout drunk at the end, is because after he tells his son to leave, it's because it's like destroying him inside, any authenticity or goodness that he had in himself, which was like this love for this boy, this genuine love for this boy. He rejects, and it's like he can't live with it anymore.
Just empty wealth left.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to Cinema of Meaning. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula. On Nebula, you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month we talked about the amazing Netflix show Beef, but before that we've also covered Fight Club, Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Drive, and many, many more. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the description. Alternatively, you can also support us on Patreon, where you'll find the Cinema of Meaning Discord community, where you can discuss movies with us and with fellow listeners, and the catalog of bonus episodes is also available there. The link for that is also in the description. Thank you for listening to Cinema of Meaning. Until next time.